Thank you, thank you. I'm Ted Russell, I'm an Oakland resident. I'm so pleased and proud to have that kind of representation, just absolutely beautiful. And this is such a wonderful time, what a wonderful experience. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so wonderful to be in this big tent. I think it's an amazing time. I'm really pleased as someone who works in Oakland at the Kenneth Rainin Foundation, supporting what we can to change arts here. And it's not San Francisco, but we are doing everything we can to give you a great experience, and we want you to, it's not San Francisco, but you can leave your heart in Oakland. It's okay with that kind of passion that we just had. I'm here to introduce John Powell. I won't be lengthy because his bio is on page 19 of your program. Check that out. I won't tell a lot of long stories, although there's a lot to read about this brother that you want to check out. He's amazing. The one thing I do love is he spent a lifetime doing this deep work, building bridges. I think the funny part of building bridges is that he got his BA at Stanford and crossed the bay and the rivalry and animosity to actually go to get his JD at the University of California, Berkeley Law School, an amazing transference, and now he's a professor there. More seriously though, in his writing and through his leadership at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at UC Berkeley, he's working to identify and eliminate the barriers that are in the way of the inclusive and just society that we're all working for. And the depth of his strategies are amazing. I've been reading his latest collection of essays called Racing to Justice. I think the conception of othering and belonging is something that's so important to our work. I'm committed to be there at the next Othering and Belonging Conference. It's happening here at Oakland in April. I hope many of you will actually come back to Oakland and enjoy that. Many of the members of our Kenneth Rainin Foundation staff will be there, so look for that. And in terms of the depth of the work and what John Powell is doing here, I want to highlight just a couple of things, because his interrogation, which is such a deep analysis, takes me back to my days of reading deep philosophy, Martin Buber, other folks really helped bring back my existentialism. But he offers a deep interrogation of structural racism, inequity in housing, the boundaries of opportunity, and these just happen to track the themes of this conference: race, space, and place. His work with Othering and Belonging deepens our understanding of the City of Oakland cultural plan, which Libby Schaff talked about, which Roberto Bedoya brought, our first cultural plan here in Oakland. And the title of the plan is Belonging in Oakland. I just wanted to briefly provide you some insights in terms of why John's work is so important and relevant to us, but that actually is self-apparent. I just wanted to make some of those connections for you. Given GIA's commitment to racial equity, I actually want to extend to each of you a personal invitation, because John's work is incredibly deep, and I actually see in it a pathway that I have not seen previously. I think we actually have an opportunity to give up the lie of whiteness. Okay? So in the space that he creates, in the psychological and ontological understanding of what whiteness is, it's a chance to look past all that complexity and make the arguments to just go ahead and give it up, okay? So that's all I've got to say. Please give a strong, strong, strong welcome to John A. Powell.
Thank you, Ted. Good afternoon. So, welcome to Wakanda. So, Oakland is an amazing place. I came back here because of my daughter and granddaughter who lives in Oakland. But it's also just the epicenter of so much happening in the world. And so I have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to hand this out to you, but I'm not going to actually show it to you right now. I just want to talk to you for a little bit, so I'm going to do that. Culture, arts. Culture and arts are incredibly important. And you're already doing incredible work. So Grantmakers in the Arts, I went on your website, I talked to people, I talked to my friend Lori. I know you're doing incredible work. So I'm not here to just applaud what you're doing, although it deserves applauding. I'm here to help you step up your game, to think about what's next and how you think about it and how you engage in it in even a deeper way. I grew up in Detroit, 6 of 9. My parents were sharecroppers from Missouri and Mississippi. And when I grew up in Detroit, I remember a time where in the day, literally in the day, you could not hear black music on the radio. And then they said, okay, we got to give black people something. So they had from like 3 to 5, 2 hours where you could listen to black music. Now, that cultural exploitation, as my friend Iris Young talks about in her work around the 5 faces of oppression. And she lists these 5 faces. There might be 6, there might be 7. The point is there are a lot. She talks about exploitation. She talks about marginalization. She talks about violence, policing. But she also talks about cultural imperialism. And it's interesting. So all the things she can talk about, she chose to talk about 5. And one of the 5 is culture. So I want to talk to you why culture is so important. And it's not just arts, it's not just music, it's not just dance, it's a whole bunch of things. And I want to help you think about culture in a bigger way. So growing up in Detroit, I'm growing up where you go to the movies as a young black boy. Well, I wasn't a black boy in the 50s, I was a Negro. Some of you may not remember Negroes. Before being a Negro, I was colored. And then Malcolm X came on the scene and he said, I ain't a Negro, I'm black. He was the first black figure, public figure in American history in the 60s. So what's going on with this sort of changing identity? Well, again, growing up as a Negro in Detroit, going to the movies, which was 12 cents, and watching Tarzan, Johnny Weissmuller, civilize the Africans. Going to television, watching television, and seeing Amos and Andy, first in blackface, but then as black people, being symbols for white people's pleasure. And then something happened. I think they called it, there was a little company in Detroit that started changing the cultural landscape. And it started suggesting that maybe black people could sing, not just in fascination or show for whites, but for themselves. And they called this little company Motown. And I remember going to high school when I'm 14 years old to a sock hop, which I'm sure most of you don't know what that is. I paid 25 cents to see this little blind kid named Stevie Wonder singing Fingertips. And in a short period of time, and the only time in history, where 10 of the top 20 songs in the world were from this one little house in Detroit called Motown. And all of a sudden it was like, maybe white people want to hear this too. So the radio extended beyond 2 hours. And so what was happening was a cultural transformation, but it wasn't just in music and art and film. It was in who we are as a people, not just black people and Negroes, but white people, Native people, Asian people. I just came back from Europe, and they had a big dance concert in Europe. Every place you go, there was music. And Motown was being blared more than the Beatles. So then I came out to Stanford. And I was at Stanford before Stanford had really discovered that there were a lot of black people in the country. And at the time, it wasn't the Stanford Cardinals, it was the Stanford Indians. And we had the mascot for Stanford was a cultural representation of the Indians as less than fully human. We still have this battle with the Washington Redskins or the Cleveland Indians. But it was a notion, again, a cultural representation of a people. And there's a famous writer who says, if you want to enslave a people, you take away their language, you take away their religion, you take away their culture, and you give them that of the dominant culture. And so culture plays a very important role in terms of understanding what it means to be human. In fact, in some ways we could say we are spiritual animals. Spiritual animals. And the spiritual part of it is transmitted through culture. Without culture, we're just animals. So the spiritual part of it is transmitted through culture. Now, just to give you a sense of how important this is, some of you may have discovered there's some writings by a guy named Harari. He's written a book called Sapiens, which is about Homo sapiens. And he makes the observation that sapiens, Homo sapiens, versus Neanderthal and the other expressions of humans were actually not that different. That is, Homo sapiens didn't have bigger brains than humans. They weren't than sapiens. They weren't faster than sapiens. But what allowed the Homo sapiens to outperform and survive beyond the Neanderthal was culture. The ability to tell stories and to create collectivity and cooperation across large groups of people. Before we had these stories, before we had these symbols, we were still closer to animals than spiritual. And what this spirituality did, what this culture did, was allow people to reinvent themselves, to allow Homo sapiens to reinvent themselves. Before that, people could only cooperate in tribes no larger than 50 people, sometimes 150, but no larger. It was all face-to-face contact. And what these stories did, what these myths did, what these narratives did, was to create new relationships, new identities that allowed us to cooperate across thousands of people. So think about it, the 2 billion people cooperating in some level around the story of Christianity. So Homo sapiens had that ability to imagine, to tell stories, and in telling those stories, to create new societies. Now this is really important in a lot of ways. There's a lot of people now running around trying to figure out, is white blood better than black blood? Some of them are associated with Nazism. That's what Nazism was about. And I like to tell the story that if you're talking about the power of blood, at least in this country, there was a story, there was a myth that some of you have heard. And the myth was, one drop of black blood will destroy whiteness. Now that's some powerful stuff. Just one drop will destroy whiteness. Now the reality is, black blood is not that strong, that powerful. What we're really talking about is the fragility of whiteness. The whiteness is so fragile that just being around blackness creates a threat to whiteness. Now, again, it's not that whiteness is that fragile, it's that whiteness is a myth. Whiteness is a destructive myth that Ted talked about. Now, I'm not talking about white people or people who identify as white. I'm talking about the ideology. I'm talking about the story of whiteness. Because the story of whiteness is a story about separation. It's a story about being special, being separated from God, being separated from nature, being separated from other people, being separated from oneself between the body and mind. So it's a story about separation and domination. It's a story about heteronormativity. It's a story about fear. And so everything is a threat to this whiteness. So it lives in constant anxiety and it becomes very destructive. We need a new story. We need a story with a larger we. We need a story where the whole world, other than white heterosexual men, is not considered other. And that's part of the work that you are doing. That's part of the work that you need to support. Now, the world is changing very fast. So, excuse me, so there's a lot of anxiety. And we see this reassertion of this white heteronormativity. So I want to suggest that as we move forward, there are ways in which art, culture, plays a critical role. We're here in Oakland. And Oakland is, as Bootsy Ryland said, who talked about sorry to bother you. He said, Oakland is actually like any other city in the United States. That is, where you have gentrification and white people also all of a sudden discovering that there are black people in their midst, whether it's eating barbecue, whether it's being on the bus, whether it's walking a dog, whether it's going into your own apartment, and somehow saying, that's a threat to my whiteness. We have to tell an alternative story where all of us belong, and there is no other. But that's a big story. That's a story that takes a lot of work. And again, there are these people who are really trying to reassert that who belongs should be organized around not just race, but around blood. And what I've tried to suggest is this blood story is a problematic story. So I'm going to give you another writer to think about. His name is Stephen Hawkins. Some of you may know his work. He died recently. He was severely disabled, but he's also considered the brightest scientist alive in the 20th century. Excuse me. And what he says is that the difference between us and the people who lived in caves is not our brain. It's not our DNA. He said the DNA of cavemen and cavewomen is essentially the same as it is for people who are alive today. So what's the difference, Professor Hawkins? He says the difference is basically culture. And that the change that happened in terms of DNA happens at a rate of 1 to 100,000 in terms of culture. So our DNA change is happening for every one significant change in DNA, 100,000 changes happen in terms of culture. So again, it's culture which does all of the work. So what are the stories that we tell? What is the music that we listen to? What is the art that we see that tells us that we are part of a larger and larger we? Now, some of you may know about the conference Othering and Belonging. And I hope that all of you will come next year to that conference. And many of you are Grantmakers, so I'm hoping you'll also support it financially. But Othering and Belonging basically says the problem of the 21st century is a problem where we have othering going on, not just at an individual level, but at a state level, at a government level, at a cultural level. Remember the Oscar So White, where they're saying, you know, black people now can't even, we know they can't do computer science, but now they can't even sing, now they can't even act. We can't find any black actors. And so Oscar So White was challenging that notion. So part of the thing is for us to actually think about how do we address this problem of othering. Now, one of the liberal responses to othering, because it's a huge problem, is what I call saming. So if you say there are people who are different than us, my response is no, everybody's just the same. Muslims are just like Christians, are just like Jews, are just like Hindus. Gay and trans people are just like straight people. And while that seems to be a useful move, it's a very problematic move because it erases our differences. So the solution for othering is not saming, but belonging. And belonging recognize that we are always in a dynamic interaction of self-creation, of othering and belonging at the same time. That we have similarities and differences, and their meaning is always complicated. And it's complicated through our structures, it's complicated through our multiple identities, and how those identities get organized and come to cohere are through stories, through culture. And so that's part of the work. Then cultures and stories then is larger than just something you like or don't like. Now, a few months ago, along with Equal Justice Society and Policy Link and others, we rented out a couple of movie theaters. And one movie theater, we gave free tickets to Wrinkle in Time. And I'd say half the audience, maybe more than half, were young girls of color. I have a granddaughter who's 9. And to be in the theater with 1,000 young girls, when they see themselves up on the screen, it was so infectious. I don't know what the movie was about, but the theater was wonderful. And then we had a discussion about it. And before that, and we had help from places like California Endowment and Akanadi and others. The theater was so infectious. Before that, we had Black Panther. Again, an Oakland-based movie. And again, about 1,000 young people, most of them people of color, and a number of them said it was the first time in their life they had gone to a public event to celebrate and to see themselves on the screen. Now think about that. These are people in their 20s, some of them in their 30s, the first time in their life. And more recently, there's the movie Crazy Rich Asians. Now think about this. It's the first movie in 25 years that wasn't a kung fu movie where Asians was at the epicenter of the movie. 60% of the world is Asian. And it takes 25 years to make a movie where we portray Asians in a positive way. There's something wrong with that picture that we have to have a 25-year gap as we try to understand the world. So this is your work. And what we're doing is not just constructing art, constructing culture, we're constructing society, we're constructing people. And usually those constructions take a long time, so we don't really think about it deliberately. Now they're happening very fast. And so your work then is not simply about art. Your work is about deliberately engaging and creating a larger we where we all belong. Your work is about emphasizing the spiritual part of our animalness. Now I confess, I'm not a humanist. We used to think that what distinguished us from all other animals was that we had culture. Now it turns out we recognize that other animals, particularly apes, have culture as well. And it confuses us because we want to be special. Well, we are special, but we're especially special when we lean into our humanness and our interconnectedness. I just came from Canada. And Canada has this thing called 6 degrees of separation. And this is actually government, community organizations, business, and they say we are all connected in some way. But they go more than just saying that. They actually, when people become citizens of Canada, new citizens, they give them a cultural package. In that package, you get a year free pass to go to museums. You get a year pass to ride public transportation. You get passes to go to cultural events. And then they bring people back together and talk about their experience. They talk about what it's like to be Canadian. And the head of Canada, the former head of Canada, has written a book about this. And the name of the book is called Belonging. And it's touched somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million Canadians. So they're not just talking about belonging, they're not just talking about culture, they're actually structuring it into their organization. And when you go to the largest museum in Canada, beautiful museum, I was just there, they have art distributed throughout the museum. But in terms of Native Canadians, they don't have just a section off in the corner for Native Canadians. They have Native Canadian art distributed throughout the museums because they're saying Aborigines and Native Canadians are not simply an artifact of the past. They're part of our present and our future. They are us. We are them. So we have something we might learn from the Canadian approach to belonging. In Canada, their arrest rate and incarceration rate is much lower than the United States. But if you are incarcerated in Canada, you don't lose the right to vote. You can vote while you're in prison because they believe that to hold on structurally and formally to our belongingness is a critical part of being a Canadian citizen. Speaking of voting, we have a system that's broken in so many ways. And we have the Republicans, and I know you guys are not political, so this is not political. But we have Republicans who've organized themselves not just around white people, because about 40% of white people don't support Republicans, but around a narrow sense of exclusive, small meanness associated with whiteness. And they're busy trying to suppress the vote. They're busy saying black people in Alabama should not be able to vote. They're busy saying, literally, not an exaggeration, in Nebraska, which has one of the largest native populations in the country, they're saying, if you don't have an address, and native people on the reservations don't have an address, you can't vote. And then we talk about democracy. So this is the work you're engaged in. Your work then is not simply about just spreading the art in some narrow way, but your role to understand how art plays a role in constructing who we are. It's not an accident that the civil rights movement was also closely aligned with spiritual coming from the churches. It's not an accident that Motown broke from just making people feel good to trying to create a woke America. And so, if we are going to survive, we have to actually think about art and culture in a different way. So when I went to Stanford, I was one of 23 black students in my class. And Stanford has this notion of, we're going to make you feel like you belong. So they literally called us together, all 23 of us. They had this white psychologist, good intention, and we had a picnic out on the Stanford lawn, and she served us watermelons. And then she couldn't figure out why we didn't feel like we belonged. Stanford was hard for me. But the thing that got me through Stanford was I didn't have much money. I didn't have a turntable. I didn't have records. But what I had is access to a library. And I would go there every day at the end of the day, and I'd listen to 2 songs. One of them was by Nina Simone called Mississippi Goddamn. And that's what it felt like being at Stanford. Mississippi, goddamn. The other one was by John Coltrane, titled A Love Supreme. And I can tell you, if it hadn't been for those 2 songs, I wouldn't be standing in front of you today. So I'm going to end. I have a few more minutes, but I want to end. And I want to remind you that, as they say, analysis is not communication. So you can do the research and get the analysis. Analysis is critical, but it's not the same as communication. Communication is not the same as narrative. Narrative actually has a deep, deep resonance. And narrative, good narrative, doesn't talk to the conscious mind, it talks to the unconscious mind. It feeds the spirit. But narrative is not the same as organizing. So you can't just have a narrative project and no organization. You got to think about, and so an organization is about power. So you need all of those things in a real alignment. And as we try to disrupt this process of othering and think about an inclusive we. It has to be led. It has to be centered, not exclusive, but it has to be centered around the most marginal people in our society. So that means blacks. That means trans people. And it has to be not just interpersonal, but it has to be structure. It has to be culture. Because structures and cultures carry messages, even if people don't intend for it. So when I was watching Tarzan as a young man, there was a message. Or when someone who's disabled is trying to get on the escalator, there's a message involved in that. And there's a concept in terms of organizing physical space, of ambience belonging. How do you create a space that says to people, you belong in this space? And it's not the same as removing barriers. It's organizing space to do the work you wanted to do. It's structural inclusion, not just removing structural exclusion. And so that's the work I want you to think about going forward. How do you, as grantmakers, and in charge of a lot of resources, how do you lean into a future that says to people they belong? How do you lean into a future that actually structures the work? And how do you lean into a future that actually goes beyond equality, goes beyond a narrow concept of equity, and actually look at how do you do it for everyone with the overemphasis on the most marginal? And this is a big task that somebody has to take on. It's not necessarily the task that all of us take on. At some point, we also have to create a new identity for we that includes a progressive group of people who today call themselves white. So the attack on whiteness should not be seen as an attack on white people. Although we got to get a new label for you. So it's a delight to be here with you in my hometown. This fight is going to be happening all over the world. And othering and belonging is a big way of understanding that. And it doesn't just about race, it's also about gender, it's also about sexual orientation, it's also about ability, it's also about age, it's also about religion. How do we actually say to people, you belong, and you can belong without having to give up who you are? I'll end by quoting a famous American philosopher who I find very helpful in understanding some of these issues. And of course, I'm talking about the famous Richard Pryor. And Richard Pryor has this skit where he's in court and he's being sentenced to years in prison. And he leans across the desk and he says to the judge, "You've taken my freedom. You've taken my job. You've taken my family. Judge, is there anything else you want?" And the judge leans across the dais and he says, "Do you have any dreams?" And what Richard Pryor is saying is that if you take a people's dream, you take their life. And so what you're doing through the arts, through supporting the arts, is actually giving people their dream, giving them the ability to imagine, to create a new future where we all belong. Thank you.